A lazy dungeon boss becomes everyone's problem when humans and monsters collide. Spoiler warning for this stretch of the Korean manhwa. The story follows Swallow, an absurdly powerful dungeon boss whose greatest desire is not conquest, payback, or world domination, but sleep. Unfortunately, his dungeon is packed with servants, monsters, enemies, fanatics, and humans who keep dragging him into disasters. Patrick, the skeleton who tries to keep the place functional, often feels like the only responsible adult in the room. Around them are Renee, Mel's, Samrat, Jeff, and several human factions caught between fear, greed, and survival. What begins as dungeon comedy keeps twisting into a darker fantasy conflict, where every nap Swallow wants becomes another crisis somebody else cannot handle. After the laboratory is left in ruins, the white-haired boss monster walks through the wreckage with a small skeletal companion, and the question hanging over everything is brutal: was this destruction actually meant to revive a subordinate? The skeletal elder presses her on the disaster, remembering the shaking ground and the terrifying surge of purple force that tore through the place. Instead of giving a grand villain speech, she responds with almost childish simplicity, which makes the scale of the damage feel even stranger. Then a black wolf-like creature is pulled into the mess, treated less like a terrifying beast and more like a reluctant guide. Jeff's scent has vanished, Samrat is sent toward a human contract, and the trail leads into a forest where a wounded purple-haired girl and a violent blonde herb seeker turn this rescue into something far more unstable. Inside the dungeon, the rules are treated like battlefield doctrine, and one rule matters more than anything else: stay quiet around Lord Swallow. That should be simple, but Mel's is the exact wrong monster for a quiet room. The purple-haired dungeon creature refuses to behave, proudly claiming her freedom and insisting that if Swallow is resting, then she belongs beside him. Her logic is ridiculous, but her confidence is absolute, and her insults toward Renee turn a basic warning into a comedy explosion. Meanwhile, Swallow and Patrick are still trying to exist in peace while the dungeon staff scramble through corridors, fortress spaces, and chain of command chaos. But the joke darkens when military pressure rises outside, and a giant skull-faced figure with blue eyes decides the current disorder is the perfect moment to strike at the Empire. The pressure spills into a tavern-like building, where an armored knight, an older gray-haired man, a black-haired youth, and an injured pale companion are caught in a tense argument. A small golden glow appears in someone's hand, and the room immediately reacts as if that object or magic could change the entire situation. Suspicion hardens on the older man's face, while the knight moves from listening to acting. Before the black-haired youth can settle anything, the knight grabs him and the scene breaks into chaos, crashing through the room and racing across rooftops under the night sky. Above it all, a skeleton-faced boss figure observes like a dark commentator watching pieces move across a board. The chase drives toward a bright doorway or dungeon-like entrance, while back at the lodging, the injured companion rests and a red-haired woman quietly appears near the doorway. The red-haired woman becomes the one trying to understand what was left behind. In the dim room, she searches near the bed and floor while a small skull-headed companion and shadowy figures linger around the black-haired youth's orbit. At first the scene carries a nervous, almost awkward energy, but every small discovery makes the room feel less safe. A dark object or book-like clue draws her attention, and then something near the furniture shocks her enough to freeze the mood completely. The danger is not just a missing person or a messy fight anymore. It is tied to warnings, a glowing red document, a golden gem-like object, and the threat of monster slayers or human forces closing in. By the time the black-haired youth stands again with a large armored presence behind him, he looks less like a victim and more like someone preparing to answer a challenge. The escape narrows into a dark alley, where the black-haired lead and his companions are boxed in by armored pursuers. A red-haired woman tries to keep the group together, but the force closing on them is too organized, too armed, and too ready to use violence. The blue-armored knight becomes the center of the threat, advancing with heavy weapons and crackling energy while everyone else scrambles for space. There are hints of a fiery demonic image behind the conflict, though it reads more like a memory, warning, or explanation than a creature physically standing there. Then the fight breaks open with lightning-like strikes, forcing the group into defense. A strange hand or branch-shaped object appears as the confrontation escalates, and somewhere beyond the alley, a purple-hooded magical figure seems to watch or interfere. The lead ends up on the ground beneath the armored enemy, and the fight refuses to resolve cleanly. After the alley violence, the story tightens inside a guarded interior where the armored knight questions the group under a heavy, formal silence. The black-haired horned youth watches from the side, guarded and suspicious, while the red-haired woman, a blonde long-haired man, and gathered townspeople try to survive the interrogation without making things worse. The room carries the feeling of a trial more than a conversation. Someone may be injured or resting nearby, and every answer seems to pull the group closer to a larger monster mystery. The tension briefly bends into comedic reactions, but outside the room the night is not calm. Shadowy attackers, alarms, and an ominous red presence suggest the danger is already moving around them. Near the end, a white-haired man turns back toward the night with a cryptic question, and suddenly this is not only about one suspect. It is about what kind of monster force everyone has misunderstood. On the demon side, the story shifts into strategy. A white-haired girl holds a serious carriage discussion with a flamboyant purple-haired subordinate and a darker companion, and the mood says they are no longer only reacting to human trouble. Purple magic spreads across the battlefield in sigil-like patterns, turning planning into an operation. A red-haired female commander appears through violent red-black imagery, framed as someone dangerous enough to shape the battle directly. Then the middle of the sequence looks backward into ruined settlements, dead civilians, and older violence tied to a feared monster power. That darker history matters because it explains why this is not just a random skirmish. The factions are moving with old wounds behind them. By the time the group regroups near a fortress or gate, the problem multiplies, a larger swarm of winged monsters appears, and someone realizes with grim humor that the enemy has a much bigger family than expected. The next turn begins with ominous imagery around a blonde woman and a pale weakened figure, making the danger feel like a memory, vision, or threat pressing in from the dark. The mood then settles into a quiet room where the blonde woman is recovering, but rest does not mean safety. She wakes, sits up, and speaks with surprising composure while a purple-hooded visitor appears for what feels like a private negotiation. Their exchange seems to involve an outside threat, an important person, and a risky plan that cannot be handled in public. Armored guards and soldiers orbit the situation, reminding us that human security is still part of the trap. Later, the scene moves outside to the black-haired protagonist and other figures as warnings about monsters and death keep piling up. Even a comedic moment with a strange sack cannot erase the feeling that someone is being moved into position. The red-haired woman and the black-haired monster-like protagonist regroup, then move through a dark ruined area where corpses, bones, and armed figures make the path feel less like a rescue route and more like a battlefield after the screaming stopped. They find a campfire-lit group of rough men who appear to be threatening or exploiting others, and the confrontation begins with distance, suspicion, and the sense that nobody here plans to back down peacefully. When the fight erupts, the protagonist's dark aura makes him look less human and far more frightening than the thugs expected. The violence clears space, but it also attracts something bigger. A purple-haired horned woman in ornate armor appears with powerful violet magic, and her conversation with him circles back to an earlier proposal. Instead of ending the danger, she prepares a basic mana detection spell, turning the ruins into a search zone. The conflict opens onto a dark supernatural battlefield, where a horned skull-like monster, shadowy creatures, and purple-black energy gather beneath a red sky. A sharp white-haired demon-like figure speaks calmly inside the chaos, while a giant blue-eyed shadow presence looms over smaller figures and makes the scale of the threat feel almost mythic. Then the story cuts away from that nightmare atmosphere into a quieter aftermath near buildings, where the black-haired man and a purple-haired woman talk with others as if trying to make sense of what just moved around them. The calm does not last. At night, attention shifts to a guarded mansion, and a small hooded intruder slips inside. Bodies fall, blood marks the floors, large guards rush in too late, and dark purple magic tears through the defense. The attacker's motive lands with chilling clarity: this is about taking back a husband. What makes this stretch fun is how the manhwa keeps balancing absurd dungeon comedy with genuinely dark fantasy stakes. Swallow's desire for sleep sounds like a joke, but every person around him treats his existence as a political, military, or supernatural disaster waiting to happen. Nels turns silence into rebellion, Patrick keeps trying to impose order, and the human side keeps discovering that monster problems do not fit neatly into knightly authority. The later chapters push the arc outward: contracts, monster slayer fear, ruined settlements, winged swarms, purple detection magic, and a mansion infiltration all point to factions colliding over people they barely understand. The cliffhanger works because the latest attacker is not just invading for power. Their personal motive makes the next conflict emotional, messy, and dangerous. Subscribe for the next manhwa recap, because this mansion attack is about to expose who really belongs to whom.